the Facebook event page, but I'm trying to send it to you via email or via chat.
Yeah, email or
I should have put
WhatsApp
my
or whatever.
earpods in.
Aura, your mic is on.
Yeah.
So we're waiting for Professor Mascalier and also for Husseina Alidou. I hope they got the time right. It's always so complicated.
I know I have to remind people all the time to give them the whole gamut of different times to like
time zones.
Yeah.
Well, Husseina is
she's at Rutgers, so she's in
Rutgers, so
yeah.
Right. Yeah. And
let me just
is
link
in New Orleans unless she's abroad.
Right. I just do everything by South African Standard Time because everything else is too confusing for me. But I will. I'm going to send them the link again.
And tell them it's now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think they're not quite in the same time zone, Adeline. So, all right, so we are slightly delayed even from a technical point of view. I'm not quite sure where Professor Alidou or Mascalier is, and I don't think we can't quite start until they are in the room. So my tech team is saying that they are dealing with some tech issues. And I've just emailed both professors to let them know that our session is starting now. My sense is that we're probably going to be running 10 to 15 minutes behind schedule based on where we are right now. But while I have you here, just to give you a rundown of how I imagine the setup happening is that I'm going to do a brief shtick where I introduce the overall theme, I introduce all of the speakers and read out your bios. And then Professor Simone, I'm going to hand over to you. So I'm going to talk for about 3 minutes, maybe 5. And then you would be giving 5 minutes talking, 5 to 10 minute talking points based on the questions. So yeah, I might chip in from time to time. And the other thing is that Aura, who's logged in but isn't talking, is going to also text me questions from Facebook. Aura, I hope you've enabled questions on Facebook so that people can get in touch, and then those will be posed here. So we have no participants in this particular forum. Now I'm really worried because I think that they've got the time wrong, or it wasn't clear enough. But while we're waiting, Malik, I don't know if you want to say anything in terms of format.
No, it's just my understanding is to basically have a go around for everyone 5 to 10 minutes and then follow it up with, I mean, the questions that are already published in a way, so it's no surprise, you know, there's no surprises, and maybe pick up on some few things that might is a way to follow up, but yeah, basically to adhere to what's already, you know, the questions that are already established.
Okay, so Professor Mascalier is here. You're on mute. Professor Adeline, you're on mute. You're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Hello, good morning or good evening, everybody. I apologize for being late. My system asked me to update the whole system, so I had to download the new Zoom and, you know, apologies.
Okay, so we're expecting a slight delay of about 10 minutes, so I think we're okay. I don't know if you know everybody else in the room, but maybe this is a good time to do introductions while we're waiting for Professor Alidou to join us. So welcome, Professor Mascalier. My name is Mpho. Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this discussion. I'm actually very excited about it. And to have such a great panel for African mobilities. I don't know if we should go around, maybe. We'll start with Malik, and then Ikem, then Jean-Charles.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Malik Simone. I'm at the Urban Institute, the University of Sheffield, and I'm an urbanist. As Jean-Charles well knows, back way in the day, we used to share the same city. We used to share some of the same preoccupations. Yeah, I mean, I left the US when I was, I guess, 18 at one point, and wound up in the Sahel for a while, and so it is a region that's very dear to my heart, even though I've not been there much in the past few years. But yeah, hello everyone, and this JC and I go way back, but I'm pleased to meet the rest of you, and I'm a great admirer of your work, and thanks for joining in tonight, this morning.
Ikem. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I'm just unmuting myself, sorry. Ikem Stanley Okoye. I'm associate professor at the University of Delaware, where I teach both history of architecture and occasionally history of art. Trained initially as a practicing architect and still occasionally do that. And I have a very long connection with sort of Sahelian issues. I sort of have entered into that field and then done other things and gone back into it again. And I'm sort of in a phase when I'm re-engaging with sort of Sahelian issues, especially in relation to sort of architecture, historical, and to a degree contemporary as well. How you say now? And hi, Adeline. Yeah.
Thank you, Ikem. Adeline, do you want to introduce yourself? I mean, it's weird because you all kind of know, no, you don't all know each other, but you know somebody on the panel.
Thank you. So I'm an anthropologist working in Niger for over years. I tended to focus on more rural issues and on questions of urban space through my work on youth and forms of sociality. And I found the work of many of you on the panel quite inspiring. And of course, the trailblazer for Niger is, you know, Husseina Alidou. So I'm following in her footsteps. She's the one who sort of made us pay attention to urban issues and questions of plurality and brassage and ethnic melting and melding. And so I'm delighted to be here with all of you, and especially to see Ikem again. It's been a long time, and I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Adeline. Jean-Charles?
Everybody, I'm Jean-Charles Dal, Mamadou Jean-Charles Dal. I'm an architect from Senegal.
You need, Jean-Charles, I think you need headphones. Do you have headphones?
I don't have them here. Somebody's going to bring them. So
okay.
Let me try to improve it until
yeah,
I get
actually you sound a lot better when you're closer to the mic. Yeah.
It's an
okay,
extreme.
then I have to turn off the camera because I look very, very strange.
You look very good, Jean-Charles. Don't worry.
Okay, yeah. So I'm an architect. I have a practice here in Dakar, and I started the School of Architecture in Dakar 12 years ago with some friends of mine, and we have graduated like 126 students at the bachelor level, and 60 of them went to the master level and are now our colleagues. And the students come from different countries in Africa. So it's not a Senegalese school, it's an African school. So I think that's what I'm going to share with you today, our reflections on Sahelian urbanism. And hi, AbdouMaliq, hi, Ikem, hi, everybody. I'm very glad to see you again, guys.
And finally, and last but certainly not least, Professor Alidou, thank you so much. My name is Mpo. It's so nice to meet you virtually. What we've been doing while you were logging on is just doing a round table of introductions before we start. So we're not live yet.
Okay, great. So it's a great honor to meet all of you again. So to meet you, Mpo, for the first time, and also Professor Charles from Senegal and other colleagues. But both Professor AbdouMaliq Simone and Professor Ikem Okoye are old friends, and with Adeline, we come a long way together. Our dear colleagues, Jennifer and Oratil, so I'm really grateful to meet you, each one of you, and I'm grateful for what I have learned from each of your works. Professor Simone, if you can recall, when I at Rutgers in 2000, and Professor Ikem too, Okoye, there was a conference on Islam in Africa at Rutgers. And so that was my first meeting with you face to face, as I was trying to present my work on Islam and women's experience in urban space, as Professor Mascalier presented. And your work featured a lot in my work, and I'm grateful that today you are bringing us again with input to think about African mobility and the question of Sahel and the diversity of Sahel, and also the creolization, right, of Sahel identity and the continuous dynamism, and as an Islamicate space. So today maybe those are the kind of conversation that we'll be talking about, you asked me to speak about Agadez, right? And the city from antiquity to the present that continues to influence our imaginary. So my work in Agadez actually starts in 87, because that's where my maîtrise work was really to look at Ingal, which is part of Agadez. So Ingal as a city and its relationship to Agadez and to Timbuktu, those ancient cities are what they have produced in terms of creolization of cultures and dynamics and attractiveness in architecture, in possibilities of encounters refashioning the self and the collective is really what my work is about. So when the crisis of migration started, a group of us from University AbdouMaliq and the University of of Agadez, and the University of Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton, come together and start to do a project to invite people to rethink what Agadez really is beyond the stereotype in the mainstream media. So I do hope to share a little bit of you from the point of view of people from Agadez, and also from the point of view of the African refugees and migrants who are featured in this media. What is their perspective? I hope these are the kind of conversation we will have. That will be my humble contribution.
Okay, fantastic. So I am hearing from my team that Facebook live stream is ready. So I am going to start with a brief introduction.
Can you send us the link for Facebook live stream?
Sorry, Jean-Charles, I thought I had done that already. It's on the African Mobilities event page, but let me see where we are with that. So,
sorry to interrupt you. It is actually on in the attachment you sent with the last message. So
yeah,
where you have the flyer, there's the live stream public transmission Facebook link is there.
Okay, so what I'm gonna
okay, but I think Jean-Charles was not included in that email from what I can see. So that might be why he doesn't have it. I can, since we are on chat, I could copy it and just put it on chat, Jean-Charles.
Yeah, for sure.
Jean, I sent it to you twice, but it's really on the African Mobilities Facebook page.
Okay, I got it.
Have you got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I got it from Paul right now.
Ah, okay.
So it seems that, okay, you're welcome. It seems that let me see, we're not as ready as I thought we would be. Jen, what's happening? Sorry, please just give me a second. Yeah, what's happening?
Sure. We're just having a challenge with linking the Zoom to Facebook. Should be ready in just a few minutes. It's a co-hosting challenge. So if you can just give us a few minutes, we're almost there. I apologize for the delay from the technical team.
Okay, Aura, can you please just let people who are waiting to get on know that we have a slight delay? And that will probably, yeah. Okay, so you've done it, thank you. And that means we should probably also adjust the time.
So Sena, while we're waiting, can I ask who's on your Agadez team?
Okay.
The project you described.
Right. So we have Professor Munkaila Haruna.
Okay.
Who is the geographer in Niger at AbdouMaliq University. There is also at University of Agadez, and our team has an agroeconomist, Mamadou, right? And then we have a psychologist, sociologist, demographer, Professor Maga, and we have a team of doctoral students who are working on women and markets. So I can actually send you their
information,
their contact. Yeah,
absolutely.
If so we have Amina Mato, who works on women and entrepreneurship. We have Bashiru Ayuba, who is a geographer, and yes, Bashiru, Musa Mahamadou. I will send you all these contacts.
Sure. So quite a large group then, yeah.
Yeah, we try to what we are trying to do, and then Professor Ricardo Laremont from SUNY Binghamton.
Okay.
It's actually Ricardo and I will start having conversation. I will work with the team in Niger, and then he will work. He's working with the team dealing with Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia. So it's a two-part team. We're trying to trace, right? So I'm interested in the gendered nature of migration through Agadez, and looking at the communities of women migrating through Agadez, and from which countries, and what are the gendered transformation operating, and how is Agadez hosting all that. So I can share with our group here any information and their contacts.
Sounds interesting. Very timely and present.
Thank you. We're trying. You are welcome all to Niger. And Adeline recent book is actually is help us surviving what is going on now with all this boredom and confinement and all this, you know. So it's a really a very insightful, brilliant book dealing with youth culture in Niger and the predicament of youth. So thank you, Adeline. Yeah, c'est super. Maybe I can post to my class. Is it okay for our classes to join? It's okay. Okay.
To join via Facebook, I imagine, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. technical difficulties are interesting because I looked at the African Mobility's website, and they've had several of these, apparently with no, Paul's had several of these engagements, apparently with no hitch. So one just never knows, and let them get it solved soon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't yet been part of something that tries to cross two different platforms, I guess. So I don't have a sense of what that entails, but.
I was just thinking earlier of the way in which, you know, Zoom or the pandemic and the technologies that have been harnessed to keep us connected have taken away from us the spaces of waiting that are part of traveling to a faraway place, you know, in an airport. In fact, I was telling myself, oh, I don't have time to prepare for this because I have so many Zoom meetings and so many webinars.
Yes.
You know, the time space has shrunk even more due to Zoom and COVID-19. So in some ways, it's kind of nice to have technology fail us because it enables us to not be as efficient as Zoom wants us to be, and I'm kind of grateful. I want those spaces of inactivity, those you know, those spaces of waste, right? Zoom forces us to be so efficient, it's exhausting.
Unhealthy too. Yeah.
I mean, having lived in Jakarta for several years, where for many reasons, no one shows up on time. I mean, if you a few hours later, an hour, that's within the reasonable. But here, the pressure to show up exactly at the moment that's designated that you're supposed to is so bizarre in so many ways.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I mean, I teach both in the classroom and on Zoom. The terror. I mean, I've been teaching for over 35 years. I am still terrified that the technology is going to fail and I'm going to lose half my students because I'm such a you know, with technology, I'm not very good. And so that sense, I mean, I feel like every time the stress, and you're right, that the way in which we enter a room for a meeting, there is that sort of transitional space-time that Zoom doesn't enable. Here we are all looking at each other. There's no transition. And, you know, and it was even now, 15 minutes ago, I was stressed because Zoom asks me to update just as I thought I was logging on, right? And it took 5 minutes to update. Why does he ask me to update now, not yesterday at night, you know, when I'm, anyway. So the time space is really shifting in a way that I think most of us are not used to. And efficiency is not always a good thing.
Yeah.
I already had 2 Zoom meetings this morning, and I was sort of sitting at both of them and started off today with the idea that I was actually going to stand up because I just think that going from Zoom to Zoom is actually quite unhealthy in its way. But when Umpa came on, it was sort of a conversation about the angles and all that. So I was like, you know what, I think I can cope with one more event at which I'll be sitting, and then I'll make sure to be standing at my class. Some of my colleagues have got themselves these movable desks that they can sort of move up and down, and they can stand when they choose to. And I think that in the end, we'll be having to transact across the sort of shrunken chronologies of moving from one meeting to another. And on the other axis will be that we have to be at different sitting or standing positions over that time. It's a kind of way of bodily transmission, transition through the spaces that I think Zoom is forcing us into as a kind of efficiency. Yeah. I mean, I begin to sort of value, which I didn't necessarily want, the idea of walking from one meeting to another or from one class to another, just the interruption and space that creates that Zoom just doesn't allow. Yeah. Maybe a future version of Zoom will build it in some way, who knows, a virtual walk from one place to another before you start the next meeting.
Well, if you're in Second Life, that's what you're doing, right?
Uh-huh.
I actually have a daughter who, my oldest daughter, who's starting a PhD in anthropology at Irvine, and she's working with Tom Bolstorff, who works in Indonesia. I'm sure you know him, AbdouMaliq. And he wrote a book on Second Life. So he actually invited all his new students to join him in Second Life way before the semester started. And they can go and visit him, and they all have their avatars. So, there are people who have transitioned.
Wow.
I find it incredibly scary. It's complicated for me to figure out my own real life. I don't need a virtual life.
So what's real life like in New Orleans these days?
Well, it's been totally difficult because, as you perhaps know or you don't know, we have a hurricane barreling towards the Louisiana coast as we speak. I just got, and it's the fourth one in less than 6 weeks. So people are exhausted. I pulled out all my, garden furniture in and out. And it's exhausting. And we don't have any, my friends are saying, are you evacuating? And we're saying, well, where? There's COVID everywhere. And, we are so tired. We can't even tell if this is real anymore, or what does emergency mean? When emergency is every 2 weeks, right? It's kind of the emergence of a new order, a new normal in which, we are asked to anticipate the end of the world, for us, right? So there's a point at which the exhaustion takes over, and we're like, well, I have to teach classes tomorrow, so maybe the hurricane will destroy my house by 8 p.m. But at 10, I have to go teach. No classes are canceled. It's very strange. So I think I'm okay. My house has been there since 1890.
So, yeah.
I'm like, to the fates. But people who are in low-lying areas that flood, it's frightening. And as we speak, in fact, I was just looking at the forecast. So the hurricane has moved west, and it's going to hit probably the town which is Lake Charles, that was hit 4 weeks ago by the first hurricane. So those people, some of them just got electricity back, and now they're about to lose it again. And you know, some have lost their homes or the roof, their businesses. You know, it's a nightmare. I mean, the peninsula of Yucatan in Mexico, I looked at the pictures. It's horrible what happened last night because the hurricane went through it. So, you know, apart from that, children are back in school, I think, or will be back in school on Monday, supposedly. And well, the rates of COVID-19 are lower because we had such a spike at the beginning, right? We were one of the hardest hit cities in the US in April or March, late March. And so we had, you know, a terrible fatality rate. It's a poor city, right? People don't have access to healthcare. They're making do with what they can, but yeah, you know, the cost of COVID-19 to New Orleans, to Louisiana is terrifying. But now we are doing better than other states that didn't take it seriously. So I don't know what that means in the long term, but you know, at the same time, the city is going bankrupt because they can't afford, you know, the two industries we have, oil and tourism, are both at a standstill. So the city has no money, so they've started furloughing people, and they may even fire them. I don't know if they have, I hope they can't do that, but you know, they can't pay them. So it's catastrophic on that end. So, you know, we are trudging along, I guess.
Yeah, New Jersey and New York also, we have been hard hit from mid-March until around June. So, but we are grateful we are at this stage now, and hope we don't return. In New York, some areas for the schools, they're going back to lockdown again. So we hope there'll be solution.
Well, clearly Africa has the answers. We should start asking public health and African leaders for answers, because clearly this country is not going in the right direction, right? I'm fascinated by the way in which all these supposedly thoughtful and informed analysts are looking at Africa and wondering, trying to find a genetic response to the lack of COVID-19, because, you know, African people couldn't possibly have an answer, couldn't possibly do better than we did, right? It's quite fascinating. It's infuriating as well, but
I think we're as live as we're going to be. So I have tried as best as I can to make us go live. As far as I can tell, we are live on Facebook. So I think this is a good time to start. So welcome everybody once again to this panel discussion on Sahelian Urbanism, Itineraries with Malik Simone, as well as Usaina Alidou, Adeline Mascalier, Ikem Stanley Okoye, and Mamadou Jean-Charles Tal. I am your host, Mpho Matsipa, researcher, chief curator, and founder of the African Mobilities Project. Some of you might already be familiar with this platform. African Mobilities 2.0 is an itinerant curatorial and pedagogical platform, a transcontinental network, an online exhibition, a podcast series by the same name, and soon-to-be publication that advances and explores research on the circulation of aesthetics, ideas, resources, and people in Africa and the diaspora through art, architecture, and urbanism, beyond the paradigm of crisis. In short, it aims to produce a living archive for and about African spatial futures. This event is a collaboration between African Mobilities and Professor Malik Simone at the Urban Institute at Sheffield University, and it is made possible with the support of the Goethe Institute in partnership with the Wits School of Architecture and Planning, the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, and the Architecture Museum at TU München. You can find more information about African Mobilities on our website, www.africanmobilities.org, as well as also social media platform, is in response to a provocation made by AbdouMaliq Simone several months ago after our first podcast, and one that I was more than happy to attend to, namely that Western Sahelian region, including parts of Senegal, Mali, Niger, Chad, Northern Nigeria and Mauritania, were not overlooked completely, have received more attention both in academic and popular media circles when it relates to questions of rackets, mafia, traffickers, and rogue elements of the contemporary times that have purportedly terrorized different parts of the region. On the other hand, the region has indeed been subjected to new regimes of surveillance, foreign military intervention, global warming, when it relates to questions of rackets, mafia, traffickers, and rogue elements of the contemporary times that have purportedly terrorized different parts of the region. On the other hand, the region has indeed led us to ask questions about what is the impact of these processes and what have the overall approaches been to spatial control. This panel discussion gathered today therefore looks to Sahelian urbanism as a mode of exploring how the long variegated history of settlement and of piecing together territories of operation in order to reach out into the larger world presently manifest themselves in Sahelian towns and cities. We're honored to have such an esteemed panel of scholars with us today, and I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Usaina Alidou teaches at the Department of African, Middle Eastern, and South Asian Languages and Literature and Comparative Literature at Rutgers University. She has written widely about Muslim women and modernity in post-colonial Africa, as well as co-edited many publications, including topics about post-conflict reconstruction in Africa and social struggles against structural adjustment in African universities, which she co-edited with Sylvia Federici and George Kafinadis. Her articles appear in Research in African Literatures, Comparative Literature, Review of African Studies, and Comparative Studies in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Professor Adeline Mascalier is a professor of anthropology at Tulane University. She has conducted extensive research on religion, gender, health, and youth in Niger, and has published numerous articles and book chapters on these topics. She has authored several books, 6 to be more precise, including Women and Islamic Revival in a West African Town, and has received numerous awards for her scholarship on Africa. Her latest book, Fada, Boredom and Belonging in Niger, is about youth, unemployment, and sociality in urban Niger. While she remains interested in precarity, masculinity, and urban space, her current focus is on mass possession of adolescent girls in the Nigerian schools via the book she's currently writing that tells the story of schools haunted by painful pasts as much as they are by imagined futures. Next, we have Ikem Stanley Okoye, who is a trained architect and historian, art historian. He teaches at the University of Delaware, where he holds a joint appointment in Africana Black American Studies. He's also served as Director of African Studies Program and is currently a Mellon Researcher with the Canadian Centre for Architecture. He's held numerous fellowships at prestigious institutions, and his essays on architecture, art, and the landscape are widely published in journals, including Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, as well as book anthologies such as Cultural Heritage Landscapes in Sub-Saharan Africa, Diasporas and Strangers, Architecture and Pictures. He has an upcoming book titled Hideous Architecture, focused on African architecture of early colonial Nigeria. Malik Simone is a senior professional fellow at the Urban Institute, Sheffield University, a research associate at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity, visiting professor of sociology at Goldsmith College, University of London, visiting professor at the African Centre for Cities, University of Cape Town, research associate at the Rujak Center for Urban Studies in Jakarta, and research fellow at the University of Taramanaga. His present research examines unconventional processes of urbanization across extended regions in South and Southeast Asia. He also explores the effects of globalized generic blackness as an organizing instrument of urban life and the kinds of political instruments necessary to circumventing racialized systems of control. And finally, but certainly not least, Mamadou Jean-Charles Tal is president of the board of the Collège Universitaire d'Architecture de Dakar, an institution that he created in 2008 with his partners Nabi Kane and Ani Juga. He also teaches in the college and is director of the Masters of Architecture program there. He's a co-director of J&T Architects and Associates and a graduate of the École Nationale Supérieure d'Architecture in Marseille. He is a former president of the National Order of Architects in Senegal and has been a member of the Dakar Biennale Scientific Committee. He is a husband, a father, a jazz musician, bass and guitar, and holds a black belt, 7th dan in Nan-Budo. So with that, I'm going to hand over to our moderator, Malik Simone. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for making yourselves available tonight.
Thank you, Mpo, and thank you to my colleagues and friends for gathering tonight to think through some of these issues and experiences of urbanization in the Sahel. Much of the motivation for this has already been written on the different social media, so I won't take up too much time, except maybe just to reiterate that the primary motivations of having this discussion to continue a process of exploring much more pluriversal notions and processes of urbanization, that the kinds of conventional and familiar ways in which we understand urbanization are becoming much more extensive, differentiated, plural, and the ways in which the Sahel may embody some of those processes which have, in some sense, don't manifest themselves necessarily within the kind of conventional city or regional form. This doesn't mean that they're within the long history of settlements across the Sahel, that there were not cities or towns, that there weren't exemplars of what we understand to be the manifestation of urbanization. But at the same time, within this region and its intricate and heterogeneous compositions of different walks of life, its circuits of movement and exchange, its oscillating compositions of alliances and communities and collective life, its various registers of intensity amongst different kinds of religious expressions, the sheer mobility of populations in some ways manifests an urbanization which in some sense could be considered ahead of its time. And incipient within it certain kinds of trends of which we now identify as urban futures. And so with that as a background, given the fact that for our contemporary attention, the Sahel is now brought to that attention as primarily a problem space, a problem of violence, a problem of uprooted lives, a problem of over-urbanization in particular kinds of settings. Niamey is oftentimes referred to as the fastest growing city in Africa. That if in some ways the Sahel embodies a kind of future urbanism in its history, a kind of reflection of the heterogeneity and pluriversality of what urbanization could be, but yet we understand it primarily now as a kind of a problem space. How might we reconcile those different kinds of realities, and perhaps look upon its problematics in a different kind of a way? So I'll just leave it there for now, and I will ask all of the distinguished panelists maybe just to provide your own reflections on these issues between 5 and just an initial round of 5 to 10 minutes. We'll go around and then we can, pursue some more specific questions as they emerge. So for lack of any better imagination, we'll proceed in alphabetical order. So Professor Alidou, if you might begin, kick us off. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, again. And thank you so much, Professor AbdouMaliq and Dr. Simone, Dr. Mpo, for inviting me, and for all the colleagues and friend panelists and the audience. I'm grateful for this invitation to a dialogue on the Sahel and urbanism. And so I've been asked to address issues of Muslim orality and gender as far as related to Agadez. So I just want to acknowledge that my recent work is a collaborative work with Professor Ricardo Laremont from University of Binghamton, SUNY Binghamton, with Professor Haruna Munkaila from University AbdouMumuni, Professor Maga Hamidou, University AbdouMumuni, Professor Musa Mamadou, University of Agadez, and doctoral students Bashiru Ayubatini, Amina Matu, and many other students who are part of this collaboration. Our part on the side of Niger is to look at the place of Agadez and this question of migration that has been portrayed in mainstream media and also nationally at times as a Professor AbdouMaliq Simone mentioned, as Sahel now a space of problem. Although the Sahel has been, from the point of view of the resident of Agadez and the region of the wider region of Agadez and Ayir Tawa, as really a space that is the crossroad of civilization. And it is a space, the city of Agadez and the region of Agadez has been and will continue in their view. It is the future for the Sahel region, because it is the place where there is a fluidity of encounters at the cultural level that brings a dynamism of aesthetics and also a dynamism that allow population in the middle and northern part of Niger to have an economic life, to have a breathing space through the flow of populations that are coming from different parts of Africa and and other world. Part of Africa, not only within the Sahel, West Africa, Sahel region, from the Muslim world, but it is an Islamicate space in the sense that it is bringing now communities, communities of migrants, migrants on their way to Europe or on the way to Asia, on the communities of youth, and the predominance of young men from different African countries that have been affected by conflict, by policies of disenfranchisement in their own government, and plus climate change and vulnerability. These young youth who do not have other economic outlets, other possibilities of envisioning the future in being immobile in their own space, in staying, as Professor Mascalier, Adeline, who is right here with us, in her recent book has entitled A Culture of Boredom offered to the youth. Those youth are resisting to be annihilated by saying they are going to transit through Agadez. And the city of Agadez see itself as the host of migrants. So if in the olden time it is a city where people in their journey will it's like a rest area, a transition area, they see it in the contemporary time. They said if before it is defined by Islam, people going to Mecca for pilgrimage, Agadez has been a passage for many population. Now, in this contemporary from 20th century and 21st century, Agadez is playing a different role because the colonial and post-colonial regime has seen Agadez in light of mining culture, where uranium, the extractive industry has attracted a diversity of citizens from Niger itself to come work first in the time where uranium and other minerals extracted in the soil of Agadez, the market was high. It has attracted diversity of ethnicity from within the nation itself. With the fall of uranium and now with other minerals, other type of possibilities have been offered. But we have to remember Agadez is a neighbor to Libya. And Libya has been for a long time the barrier, the place during President Gaddafi's time. It was a laboratory, a space where African youth who are in search of labor, who were thinking of going to Europe, were retained in Libya because they were giving jobs. But with the fall, the demise of Gaddafi, these African youth are continuing their trajectories. So they pass through Agadez in their journey to Europe. So there is that one set of demographic. We have to look at them as the demographic of young men and some women too. We are not discussing the question of African youth who have been working in places like Libya and Algeria in the plantation areas, all the agro produce that we have been receiving in part of Agadez and the Sahel region, Senegal, all these West African countries were labor of these young youth who have left their countries and come and become laborers in North Africa, and more specifically in Libya. So Libya has a plurality. So the concept that Professor Simone is asking us to think of, even within Libya, there are a plurality of this youth who are converging in Agadez. They were the youth from different African countries who were looking for jobs and in their way to Europe were retained in Libya during Gaddafi. So they acquire expertise in building cities. There are major cities, towns in Libya, which were constructed by the diversity of these African youth who were retained in Libya. So there's this type. There were also the youth from Niger and the Chad and other places contesting their own government who were absorbed in Gaddafi's army. These are also the type of youth that come back to Libya. And then there are the youth from all the way from Central Africa, the Congo's war, and the wars in the Horn of Africa has created, and Cameroon and the Boko Haram has pushed youth who may be Muslims, or majority of them may not be Muslims, who are on the move to go to Europe. These are, in the contemporary time, the type of plurality of nationalities that we are finding, and also ethnicities, and also religion that are joining the Nigerian youth too, who are moving from other spaces of Niger to come to Agadez on their way to either finding jobs in Agadez or finding their way to join to Europe. So the trajectory is no longer to go to Hajj, but the trajectory is to go to Europe. What is interesting for us to how these youth see their own mobility, they're saying, well, if there are forces of structural adjustment programs which have weakened African states, which to a point that African states, in addition to structural adjustment program, in addition to the level of corruptions, in addition to the issues of climate change and vulnerability, have been displacing people, have been producing refugee and migrant population. They cannot understand why some African countries, including Niger, will accept European Union position for Niger to contain this youth in their mobility towards Europe. Europe can come with its multinational corporation, its extractive industries, to try to absorb African, whatever are the resources of Africa. However, Africans are not free to be more mobile. So within the African space. And so they pose the question, some of them who are part of ECOWAS. Within the ECOWAS framework, there is an agreement of free circulation of bodies, of citizens from the ECOWAS region. But it seems like even if you are part of the ECOWAS region, you are not free to be inhabiting that space. So what does it, how did the population, when a law was enacted, which in May 26, 2015, under the pressure of European Union to contain migrants, right? Making migration through Agadez illicit. The population themselves from Agadez have called it la loi criminelle, the criminal law, because they said Agadez live with the tourism. Agadez breathe with, it is a city of tourism or hospitality. So what women have done of Agadez, they have mobilized, they say we are the city of hospitality. And as a city of hospitality, we are going to frame it within Muslim understanding of hospitality. We are the mothers of these young people, and we are not going to allow the law to undermine our right to be mothers of these young youth migrants into Agadez cities, because they bring migratory competencies. They bring a new culture to Agadez, which allow us to live. And our hospitality economy gets improved. So they have gone to
Did we just lose Professor Alidou?
It seems that way.
Oh.
But perhaps we can return to her, and Professor Mascalier, can you maybe step in?
Oh, Professor Mascalier, we can't hear you.
Oh, okay. You can't hear me now?
No, the sound is not great. Can you sit closer to your mic or to your computer?
Okay. That work now? Can you hear me?
You're very far away, and you were very clearly heard earlier when we were having our introduction conversation. So something's changed on your end, Adeline.
I think it's the instability of the internet, and something I can't control. This is also perhaps part of
we can't hear you.
Can I suggest that maybe we speak to Professor Ikem Okoye, and then we return to Professor Mascalier once hopefully the internet story will be resolved. Professor Okoye?
Okay, in a way, it's probably a good transition as well. Given that Professor Alidou was just speaking of Agadez, I'm not sure she even knows this, because I can't remember our last conversations in terms of what I was working on at the time. But I have to say that I'm someone who had lived in London in my earlier years, then went back and went to school in London. After that, lived in Chicago, lived in Boston, and have worked in New York, where I taught briefly at the City University of New York's architecture department. And I thought I sort of understood the nature of sort of urban space, because at the Bartlett School, where I did my architectural training, it not only combined a rigorous sort of architectural training in terms of practice, but was a place of research for planners who were working on sort of so-called third world issues at the time, but also hosted the sort of spatial analysis laboratory at the time, led by Julian Hansen and Bill Hillier. So the sort of understanding of the modern city in terms of its sort of spatial structure, arrangement, and all that, but also the sort of social worlds that define what modernity is, I thought I had sort of pat down until my first visit in 1987 to Agadez, where I have to say that I was quite puzzled because of the tendency, I think, what one heard from especially sort of European thinkers about urbanism, of the sort of place into which sort of African cities might be placed, right? That African cities were sort of a place in which space in relation to human settlement and even sort of ethnicity was a rather sort of territorially organized one in which people speaking one language occupy some kind of clearly defined terrain, and you move across the border and you're in another world where people are speaking a different language, have a different ethnic identity and all that. So Agadez was puzzling because here I was in the middle of the Sahel, which, you know, not too far from Timbuktu, in sort of the European imagination is the space that's at the end of the world. And something about the cosmopolitanism of its population, I was a little bit staggered by. Not just was there an encounter between sort of Hausa and Tuareg and Fulani peoples, Jerma and other ethnicities sort of mixed together. And I could sort of initially identify people partially because of what they were wearing. It was sort of puzzling to encounter the sort of comfort level between different peoples who didn't seem to have, even outside Agadez itself. So when you move to some of the smaller towns, all the way down to places like Tahua and even the margins of Zender, to understand that sort of spatial occupation and its dynamics was rather different from what I had been prepared for in relation to Western notions and studies of cities and its occupancies in terms of what we might describe as sort of, not just sort of the cosmopolitan present, but also the future, right? So I can sort of say that when one, depending on what the season is, you're sort of approaching this urban space in the distance. And I'm struck by a particular image I have of the landscape from a distance in which you could see the city, but you could see a sort of linear, elongated linear space in which Fulani peoples, at least they're called Fulani in northern Nigeria, Fulani peoples occupied in temporary structures because of their transhuman lifestyle, really occupied a sort of dominant space that seems to frame the city when you're sort of approaching it from a distance. And as one then engages the city subsequently, one sort of finds that there is a difficult initially to comprehend relationship between moving peoples and those who are in some ways settled within that city space, that it seemed to be much more comfortable than one would have imagined. And it sort of led me as a historian to sort of begin to ask certain questions about my own sense and understanding of cities and the relationships between sort of architecture and the law and sort of ownership of territories, even within the space of the city. So I think unlike perhaps Husseina's own work, and I think that would be true too of Adeline Mascalier's work as well, I, as a historian and art and architectural historian especially, started to sort of go back in time to sort of explore, well, how does one understand this space? And when I say understand this space, it has to be understood in a way that I was also referring to my own experience in which, in a particular sort of European city setting, I'd encountered sort of Roma, so-called traveling peoples who seem to have a great difficulty being accepted in the sort of settled world of a place like urban London or the outskirts of London in Essex, a kind of disturbing legal imposition on those moving peoples that just did not seem to be present in the universe of Agadez and subsequently in other Sahelian cities. And of course, it then unfolded over time as I sort of got to understand the history, that actually this is sort of a long history of the Sahel, right? And Susan and Roderick McIntosh, the archaeologist team, of course, sort of suggests that in their work in the Niger Bend, that the cities of the Sahel in some sense are, have generated a form of urbanism that is likely, and this is work they're only at the beginning of in a sense, but that is likely to be competitive with our understanding of the history of cities in the sort of Tigris-Euphrates basin in the Middle East currently, or even in the sort of territorial states of Egypt. So I absolutely agree, sort of looking back, that some of what Hussein was just beginning to sort of have a conversation about in relation to the future, that Sahelian cities historically already seem to have invented a sort of structure for spatial inhabitation in an urban context in which notions of permanence are comfortably intertwined with notions of ephemerality and motion, that given sort of the universes in which we currently occupy, the sort of pressures for movement that are being stifled by, for instance, what we've just sort of had a conversation about, the European community, that something about Sahelian cities seem to me to offer a lot of the logics that we actually all, as a sort of global community, will be forced to have to learn from in order for anyone to actually have a future. You know, the sort of European insistence on sort of limiting the possibility of motion of peoples, it could be seen as a kind of temporary mix, sort of temporary fix. But I have to imagine that when one sort of thinks not just in terms of 5 years or 10 years, but in a sort of Sahelian notion of time, that this idea is just not going to be sort of sustained if we're all going to remain in some sense human. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Okoye. Professor Mascalier, can you see if you're... I can hear you.
Does Professor Mascalier have a headset by any chance? Mic?
Yeah, she's using earphones, yeah. But is she muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to use the headphones. They don't seem to work. So thank you and apologies, deficient technology. So thank you to Professor Simone for inviting me to join this panel, and thank you to Info, Masipa, and to the previous speakers for laying the field so eloquently. So in response to the questions that were posed to us, I wanted to consider for a moment how ordinary people mitigate the alienating effects of planned and police processes of urbanization that are aimed at serving the needs of capital. The city I know best is Niamey, and a segment of urban population that I've worked with are young men, many of whom are unemployed or underemployed. Now, we've mentioned that the Sahel has undergone drastic changes in terms of the new foreign military intervention, global warming, new policies aimed at discouraging migration to Europe. There's no doubt that diverting funds to confront extremisms in Niger, for instance, has had an impact on national and regional budgets, forcing governments to sort of move around money that might have been used to support other projects. But in many ways, some of the processes I want to briefly describe have a longer history, and so perhaps not as long as the arc that Ikem tried to draw for us. I think I'm going to focus on just the past few decades. But it's clear that Niamey is home to a very large informal proletariat that operates and subsists in public spaces, and that this informal economy dominates Niamey. Large numbers of residents are have spreading their activities in the street. Some of them rely on portable infrastructure. So we've been talking about infrastructure. Clearly, there are many different kinds of infrastructure, including portable ones. And so this is, I think, important if we're going to speak to forms of possession and dispossession that are aimed at planning the new city to make it more hospitable to the workings of capital, including foreign capital. Now, Niamey, in fact, has been in the past decade transformed because the plan by the government is to turn Niamey into an elegant city. And so there's an effort to beautify the city while disenfranchising the poor who make a living in public spaces. So the plan is called Niamey Niala, Niamey la Coquette, or Niamey the Elegant One. And it's clear that we have seen over the past few years, in particular in 2016, a very sort of concerted effort to remove vendors and other people who work in public space, to remove them, to dispossess them from their livelihoods. In fact, many kiosks and shops were bulldozed to transform the capital. This was supposed to be in preparation for the African Union meeting that happened in 2019. But clearly, there's a longer plan to beautify the city by making it ultimately inhabitable for the large majority of urban residents. So in my work, I focused on male forms of urban sociality, more specifically tea circles that are known as fada in Niger, where young men grapple with a shortage of employment opportunities while drinking tea in the company of similarly disenfranchised peers. And so for me, the fada as a very transient, certainly temporary kind of human infrastructure, to use the terms of Professor Simone, instantiate how some human residents are using the street and at the same time transforming their neighborhoods when they don't have the power to transform, the larger environment. They're literally sitting in the street in small groups. Some of those groups are informal, some less so. But what we see is that the fada makes possible the emergence of new expressions of sociality, new performance of urban identity, which is, I think, what Ikem was talking about as well. This notion of cityness, right? Now, when I say we need to look beyond the so-called crisis of the past few years, it is mainly because the emergence of the fada is linked to several factors, including demographic growth, economic transformation, ecological changes, of course, that accelerated urban migration and youth unemployment in the 1990s. And so for me, the fada highlights how some urban residents are made and remake and make themselves in and through the social space of the city, right? And so we can look at, of course, the way in which, interestingly enough, the fada are very linked to the emergence of private radios that occurred in the space of democratization that was sort of initiated in the early 1990s. So in some ways, the radios, for me, well, basically they force us to think about the city as a kind of, through the architectonics of sound, right? How does the city, I mean, we're so focused on the visual always, right? But how does sound enable certain forms of sociality? And when you see the fadas, at least early on, the first 2 decades, all of them had this large boombox, right? And they communicated with one another through the messages they sent to the radios, creating a kind of amplified sociality that was quite striking, especially, of course, enabling them to enhance, forms of masculinity that they couldn't do otherwise. The cell phones has changed all that. It has privatized the fada. It has inwardly created spaces where, in fact, we have to rethink what sociality means when each young man who's sitting at the fada is listening to his own cell phone, right? And not talking to the guy next to him. So questions of sociality, questions of amplified sociality, but as always as well, for me, questions of privacy. So this is something that scholars, geographers in particular, have tried to tackle by looking at how, in fact, those very public settings also enable a kind of intimacy, right? A kind of interior belongingness, a way in which you create the fada or any form of grouping by making it intimate, something that's cut off from the outside world. So I think that has a lot of implications for how we think about streets, for how we think about the flow, the mobility of people. A single block in a Niamey neighborhood may count 6 or 7 fadas that each claim a piece of the street as theirs. So it's very much piecemeal, right? It's not some sort of organized plan. It's very much haphazard. But at the same time, they're clearly transforming the texture of the street. What the fada has enabled me to think about, or forced me to think about, as someone who really hadn't considered urbanity in all its different implications, is how the fada recapitulates the recent evolution of Nigerian urban centers. And I think here I'm touching on something that Husseina was saying earlier. How is the city a space of convergence? How is the city a space of meeting space for people, for things, for ideas? It's clear that the young men, many of them come from rural areas. They're meeting at the fada with other young men. I remember once asking a group of young men at one fada where they were from, and I assumed they were all going to tell me they were from the neighborhood. In fact, none of them had been born in Niamey. And so it was really interesting that, here were 15 guys who claimed the city, who claimed the street, but their particular forms of attachment were very temporary, imagined, practiced on an ordinary level. And that's the other, I think, aspect that I want to touch on. And I find it's important to stress the ordinariness of those forms of occupation, those forms of colonization. They're humble, they're ordinary, they're hopeful. Every once in a while, they're perhaps a little more provocative, a little bit more revolutionary. But for the most part, they're really about claiming a space that will enable young men to look to the future. It's very much about future making. So you appropriate public space and you undermine existing spatial arrangements that naturalize structures of inequality because you're hoping to, at some point, move into adulthood, move into something that's already there, right? So it's not revolutionary. You're just sort of waiting. I mean, it's, as Hussein was saying, it's very much about boredom, about waiting, about waiting out, you know, this space of disempowerment and unemployment. And so if we, I'm here, I'm just really inspired by the comments that were sort of made before I spoke. I think that we need to think about the Fada and other forms of socialities as, of course, places of belongingness, but they constitute critical nodal points, right? They're actually nurturing wider networks of mobility and exchange. And this is why it's something that I haven't really done in the book I just wrote about Fada, but we really need to think about the droughts, land shortages, environmental degradations, and other factors, how they've, in fact, enabled the constitutions of Fadas and other forms of urban socialities. And also, in fact, if Niamey and other cities are defined by migration and ethnic mixing, we need to understand how those tea circles, or grains as they're called elsewhere in Francophone Africa, how they're actually contributing in all kinds of ways to the dense traffic of people, goods, ideas, right? So Fadas have really helped me to think about urban space as a kind of relational process, right? It is about relations. It is about networking. Young men know that they can go back to their home village, but they have a place at the Fada. Those networks are constantly nurtured. People don't forget you. You've created your little space. So I think that this is really important. Even though people constantly make differences, make distinctions between the city and the country in ways that may not be advantageous to the country, nevertheless, they feed into one another in all kinds of complicated ways. So I don't know how much time I have left, but
you're out of time. But only for now, only for now. Thank you so much, Professor Mascalier. I'm going to hand over to Professor Simone, or was it Jean-Charles?
Jean-Charles, please.
Okay. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you for making me a part of this conversation. In fact, myself, I started researching cities and urban conditions because of my day-to-day practice and the fact that as a practicing architect, I'm confronted every day to those problems we are talking about. And I've been working in different cities. I had projects in Niamey, in N'Djamena, in Bamako, Dakar, Conakry, all around West Africa. And it seemed to me that there is a pattern when you talk about cities in Africa. I mean, when we talk about, we meaning the people who make decisions about our urban areas. The first thing that everybody has to remember is that when the World Bank or our governments talk about the cities, they're talking about Niamey, Bamako, Dakar, Conakry. They're not talking about Timbuktu or Agadez or Djenné or Gao. they're talking about the main capital cities. And if you look at those cities, they are all from the colonial network. The colonial network framed our territories with cities that were designed for a purpose. Second, you can see that when we talk about urban Africa, we talk about problems, and we have to recognize that a lot of money has been spent. A lot of energy has been put in researching the situations. We have plans, we have strategies, etc., etc. But the situation is not improving. In all those cities, I found the same problems. Electricity leaks, water supply problems, sanitation problems, floods, unemployment, healthcare problems, etc. Generally poor living conditions. And I started wondering why the different efforts that were made did not improve the situation. And then I think I've been talking a lot with AbdouMaliq about this. The idea came that maybe we should regard our cities, our spaces for each society as tools for the society to get organized and to develop. And let's suppose that the assumption is right, that cities may be regarded as tools. It means that the cities that we are talking about when we talk about urban problems in Africa are colonial tools that have been designed in a purpose that was mainly the purpose of the interest of the ex-colonial powers. When you see Dakar, Dakar was not designed for Senegal. Dakar was designed to be the capital of West Africa, Francophone West Africa. When you see the main roads and railway systems, they all go from inside the continent to the seaside, and mainly to export goods from the inside to the outside of the continent. That's the reason why you have very poor infrastructure linking the different directions. I mean, you have the port of Dakar, you have the port of Conakry, but between the direction Niamey to Dakar and the inside of Guinea and Burkina Faso to Conakry, you don't have links between those two separate systems. So to me, I started regarding our cities as tools that the colonialism and the maybe that's not a good word, but I don't have another word, the capitalist system created for the exploitation of our territories. And that's the reason why we still regard Tombouctou, Agadez, Djenné, etc. as touristic areas, but they have no more power in the global structure of urban West Africa. So starting from that, I wanted to understand what created the problems that we live today, because today is now 60 years after our independence, and we did not achieve real progress. I mean, this year, you have had floodings everywhere in West Africa, and people talk about exceptional rain. But in Senegal, for instance, that was 60 millimeters. I would not call that exceptional rain. And I started finding out that we ourselves have a problem. It's that we took the tools from somebody else. We did not decide that we are going to use the tools in a different way. And if you look at the economy of Senegal up to very I mean, maybe the 10 past years, our economy was built on growing of peanuts. And the whole structure of the economy, including the railways, the roads, etc., was still organized as a way to get the wealth from inside the country to outside the country. It's not something that is designed for the population. Then comes the question of the growth of the population, starting especially from the 70s with the drought that existed in our countries in those days, and the huge rural to urban immigration that arose. And you come to a situation where you have tools that you did not design, that you barely control, inside an economy that is extroverted. It turned to the outside, and you want to build something that is viable for the country. It's a little bit strange. Then comes the question of which culture you are using, because a city is not just a place where you have trades, I mean commercial trades, etc. That's a place where people live. And those people are supposed to live with their culture that helps define the rules that will apply to everybody in the city. So we have rules, especially in Senegal. We are champion of the world in designing rules. And we champion of the world in breaking the rules. So that's a very strange situation where it's not a lack of rules to organize, but you see that those rules absolutely do not fit to the people and do not fit to the culture of the people. I was just very interested by the presentations that were made just before, because I had my students study informal vendors in Dakar. We call them informal, but then we discovered that this is not informal at all. I asked the students to pretend that they want to sell something and to just sit on the street like people do, and to see what would happen. And then the vendors came and said, "You cannot sit here, this is my place." And sometimes they said, "I inherited this place from my father." So there is order, there is organization, but this organization does not fit at all with what we call modern organization that we are using to run the cities, to run the country. So that took us to think about which type of culture and which elements of our traditional culture are we putting into the management, the creation and the management of our cities. And I heard this term, I think somebody, maybe Ikem, talked about modernism and modernity. Our governments today, and the example of Niamey is very interesting to me, our governments talk about our cities as way of promoting themselves, mainly in terms of architectonics, in terms of the image of the city, and they very often forget about what's inside, what makes the city move, the culture, the people, etc. So in Niger, they said that they would beautify Niamey. In Senegal, we decided to build a brand new city from nothing. So we took fields 30 kilometers from Dakar, and we built this, we start building this new city, which is called Diamniadio. And there is a brochure that the governmental body is using to promote Diamniadio. And there's, I mean, if you see the models of buildings that they want to build in Diamniadio, it's just frightening. And they have this sentence, which is terrible to me. They say, we are going to do more than Dubai. So the role model for our architecture and for our urbanism is Dubai. Because, and when you talk to governmental officers coming from Dubai, they have like stars in their eyes when they talk about this big city, you know, with the huge buildings, etc., etc. But they don't talk about the people living in there. And they don't talk about how the people live in there. So other questions that arose from this is, what is the goal of the people deciding for us when they want to organize the city? What is the goal of our governments? And talking about governments, I know more of what we call Francophone West Africa. I hate the term, but that's the term that we are using, from French colonizations. And in all our cities, you have this way of thinking that big is good. So you have projects in Burkina Faso, in Abidjan, and I heard about projects in Nigeria too, on Lagos, and it's terrifying because their model, the main model, is Dubai. You have to do something that looks like Dubai. If you don't do that, you're not modern. And then they introduce this term of modernity inside our minds, which comes to a situation. I was just saying that 2 or 3 days ago, that in Senegal, when somebody tries to sell you something and you say, no, I don't want to buy it, it's not good, he will answer, oh, it's very good because it's imported. So modernity means imported, and imported means good, which on the contrary will say that whatever we produce ourselves is not good. And we have this complexity inside our minds that do not allow us to think by ourselves about our own cities, our own spaces, the relationship between cities, rural areas, etc., etc. So we do not design our cities for ourselves. When you see the plans that are proposed by the different governments for the development of our cities, it's an extrapolation of the situation today. So statistically, we have like 3.5 million inhabitants in Dakar. In 2030, in 2030, we'll have 5 million. So how do we accommodate those people? There's no critical thinking about what we want to do, what we want to achieve in building cities, in organizing our cities. And that's a main point for me of researching, because when you see the way things are moving, I mean, the jihadist fighters in Mali, in Niger, in Chad, Cameroon, all those guys, this should not surprise anybody. The kids that are ready to die in the sea or to die in the desert to achieve a better living conditions, they will be ready to go get a weapon and fight if they are taught that this will improve their conditions. So to me, it's critical. It's a matter of life and death that we have a real reflection on our situation, on our conditions, and on how to restructure, and that's the point I came to, restructure not only the cities, but restructure our whole understanding of what we want to become as a nation, as a group of nations, etc. It's not about just about the structure of the city. It's about the structure of the society that we are building. At the moment, right now, we build something very, very, very strange, and something that is not efficient for harmony, for the development of the people within the territories. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Jean-Charles. Quickly, to return to Professor Alidou, if I might ask a quick question. Given what's been said, given the sort of the multiple and different claims and registers of belonging operative within a place like Agadez, given the criminalization of mobility, given increased global surveillance, given the resistance of mothers who want to claim their stake in reinstituting a kind of culture of hospitality. Given all of these different kinds of forces at work, if you were the mayor of Agadez, what would be your first steps in trying to think through how you're gonna navigate concretely these different kinds of forces at work?
This is quite a question, a challenge, but I will try. But I'm going to build on what your own work, and also what my colleagues on the panel have said. We will. I want to start with the concept that Professor Tal suggested. What is the new thinking, the critical thinking? How do we affirm life? How is African life important? How is African culture important in rethinking a decolonized model of living that is affirmative of Africa, and that also brings Africa into dialogue with world civilization? Because after all, Agadez, cities like Agadez or Timbuktu or Jenny, they're still the site of tension because the hegemonic forces recognize what happened is if we affirm culture and we put culture in dialogue with other cultures, if culture is a product for civilization, it is important that we affirm African civilization, African culture, and we allow African agency and African imagination to come to the table in forging its own relationship with the other. That they're saying we are not seeing this flow of people as foreigners, as alien. Our notion of African hospitality is actually, if it is absorbed in the city planning, in the place planning, it is going to create a culture of prosperity and also culture of peace, negotiated. It's a negotiated affirmation of one another to a point where the communities coming will understand why the survival of this place, the thriving of this place is important to their own lives. So would not be the kind of violent extremism that we are talking about now, right? So if I am a mayor of the city, I will do exactly what the mothers of Agadez did, to go and see the Sultan, to say, we are mothers of all African or all visitors, because they are all Africans from different African countries, different African cultures, we're a city of hospitality to Africans, but also to the non-Africans who are trying to impose those policies against us. Today, it's much easier if you are a non-African to circulate freely. You can see Europeans, you can see Chinese, you can see everybody. But you cannot see African circulating without their bodies being criminalized, without them being suspected as criminal. Or the people of Niger, the citizens, who are all of a sudden called traffickers. So during our interview, some of the Agadez people said, in the olden time, we have been communicating with all other places in the world through the camels. But today, there is the car. Why is it that when we are moving people in the car, we are criminals? But when we are moving them all over, they want us to remain in a space. They're fixing us even in time. They are refusing Africans' agency to imagine its own modernity and modernism and dialogue with civilization. So we have to do what Professor Tal is just talking, and also Professor Ikem and Professor Mascalier. This being mobile identity, ephemeral, and hospitality, you know, wherever you go in the Sahel, is a very important asset for the culture of modern state, and if we are to survive the future. Climate vulnerability is going to happen, and people are going to be in moving, even if they are not going to go to Europe. And the Sahel economy thrives with mobility. The more people are stagnant, there is no flow of people and goods and culture and vibrancy. The more violence is going to be harbored. And this is not what a nation state is about. So I want to come back to the last point. Do we need a nation state, or do we need a nation society that affirms African lives, rather than create a nation state that respond to hegemonic forces from outside, who comes, if you have an extractive company, or if you have whatever model of planning gated communities. For instance, everybody wants to show they are civilized now. They are producing gated houses. So they're blocking the concept of hospitality that is thriving for African economy. Everybody wants to build cement in a place with more than 40 degrees Celsius in April. We don't have AC, we don't have water. This is a problem. So as a mayor, I have to do decolonization of thinking, decolonization of how we look at our resources, and decolonization in international relations, and decolonization with these partners from all over the world. We have to decolonize. We have to decolonize by making a culture of love and hospitality the way Africans conceive it, as the model for rethinking the modernity and modernism, and being mobile identity, and being ephemeral, and being diverse is the kind of language that we have to reclaim. I don't want to see somebody because they are not Muslim, or because they are not Fulani or Tuareg or Hausa, then to start seeing the African, like myself, like our diversity, as a problem. This has been the colonial model, which the post-colonial has embraced, and it has to stop, because Africans, no matter where we go, with all the racialization, racism, and pushing African out, the African space has to be viable for any Africans, no matter where we are, and we should not be criminalized.
Thank you, Professor Alidou. Mpo, how are we for time?
Time has become a rather fluid concept in this panel discussion. So I would say I think we should give it another 30 minutes, and let me know if there's a possibility for taking any questions. So if you want to engage Professor Mascalier or Ikem in further questions, then we should do that. But I would ask our panelists to please try and keep their responses as rich as they are to 3 minutes, just to leave a little bit of time for maybe 1 or 2 questions at the end. So I would say minutes.
Can I rudely interrupt and make a really quick comment with apologies? Very, very quickly, I was sort of interested in John Charles's comment about Jene Agade's Timbuktu and such cities as the relationship with the colonialism and the relative sort of marginalization that maybe they suffer in the present in relation to power. But I was sort of just remembering, and I don't know, John Charles, you've sort of traveled widely. I don't know if you've ever been to Kano in northern Nigeria, but I think here
no, unfortunately.
Sorry?
No, unfortunately.
Yeah, because here we have a city that I believe is older than Agadez in its sort of its moment of foundation. I don't know, it's been in existence, 8th century, 9th century, perhaps. And yet it's an absolutely vibrant universe of modernity now present, although it does suffer from many of the same problems or issues that we might find, say, in Dakar. But I quickly remembered a moment in which, given your comments about Dubai and that kind of modernism, one of the well-known Nigerian political figures who was once the head of the central bank, an incredibly well-educated Fulani individual who actually could have run for president and probably would have had a good chance of winning, sort of realized what was going on in Kano and chose, rather than go that route, to sort of run for traditional political office. And he finally sort of got appointed the emir of Kano. So I think he was sort of trying to sort of imagine a way in which the traditions of African Hausa peoples would somehow be critical to the imagination of Kano's future. And he lasted, I don't know, probably for about 3 or 4 years, and there was a kind of revolt against his idea of modernism by the elements within the sort of electoral democratic state, and they sort of ousted him. And I think that sort of speaks very, very directly to sort of the problem of factions within such an African city in relation to sort of that imagination of the future, right? There are those who sort of really understood sort of the global problem and the nature of our relationship with colonialism in the post-colony and an attempt to redirect the possibilities for the future. But there's a large resistance in some ways from a different sort of modern section that at least in the context of Kano seemed to subvert that possibility, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Okoye. Adeline, Hussein has talked about mothers in Niamey, and Fata is primarily a kind of sociality amongst young men and boys, even though in your book you do talk about the kind of complicated relationship of young men with young women within in these neighborhoods. But what about the girls? What about the position of young women within urban spaces and the nature of their residency, particularly in the Sahel, where it oftentimes international attention is paid to the sort of victimization of younger women. But how do you think about the sociality of the girls in terms of evolving urban space?
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, obviously, the Fada as a male experiment is an experiencing togetherness. women, of course, do get together, and this is something that Husseina has written a great deal about. But there are forms of togetherness, there are expressions of sociality, different paths. They're less visible. Can you hear me?
No, you need to move closer to your microphone.
It's very hard because it's right there in front of me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So
Thank you.
I'll start again. Sorry about that. I was saying that, well, Fada's as masculine projects, masculine urban projects are experiences, experiments in togetherness. The forms of sociality that young women engage in is far more tenuous, far less conspicuous than men's for a variety of reasons. Now, we know a great deal about older women, mature women, senior women. In fact, this is something that Husseina has written a great deal about. The forms of social exchange and wealth, the mobility of wealth within networks of exchange that women engage in. For younger women, it's far less visible. And I think, in fact, much of what is happening takes place either, I think it takes place largely in schools when girls are in school. I think it's something we need to write more about, in fact, because in Niamey at least, and in other parts of the Sahel, but certainly in Niger, gendered occupation of space is such that women have far less of an opportunity to congregate together in public spaces, young women. The only place where they do so is the school. So that's actually something I'm looking at in terms of, what happens in schools through networks of sociality, friendships. They too have dreams, of course. They too have visions of the future, but mostly, this is something that maybe Husseina can speak to more. I don't see them being so focused on sort of global spaces and means of migration than men. They're more interested in forms of future that include marriage and maternity for the most part. And there's tremendous pressure, of course, from young women to marry and to have children. And so even the most ambitious women, of young women, tend to have conflicted ways of imagining themselves. Wow. I can hear it too now. It makes a lot of noise. So young women have more conflicted ways of imagining themselves in urban spaces. What tends to happen is that they're more rooted in domestic and familial spaces. They have connections with their mothers and other elder women in their households, in their communities, in their neighborhoods. But I'm not so sure they're imagining themselves outside of workspaces and domestic spaces. I would say they move across those two spaces. What's in between is largely still a kind of transient space. They don't inhabit the streets. They don't inhabit public spaces in the way that men do. And therefore, And it might be an oversight on my part, but I don't think they have an imagining of urbanity that's similar to what young men have by virtue of colonizing the street on a regular basis.
Okay, thank you, Adeline. For either Ikem or Jean-Charles, as architects, architectural historians, a sense of a kind of longue durée. If you take the kind of volatility of many of Sahelian urban spaces, you take a place like Kidal, or if you take a place like Maiduguri, where this volatility cuts in different ways. There's part of it that's generative, there's part of it's destructive. There's a kind of uneasy sense of who's who and who's going to be looking out for whom, and a kind of precarity, unsettling that is both volitional and involuntary. There's this kind of flux. What kinds of tools, architectural, urbanistic, spatial, can you foresee being somehow useful or viable within urban conditions of volatility, where the volatility itself is somewhat ambivalent, neither necessarily generative nor necessarily destructive? How do you, as architectural historians, think about the prospects of these kinds of urbanistic tools in these kinds of contexts?
Ikem, do you want to start?
I was going to listen to you first, so you go ahead. Oh, and if you need time to think, I can go too. So,
no, it's okay. The idea for me is the volatility itself shows that we don't refer to the spaces as spaces that we own. Let's take, for instance, a place that you know, AbdouMaliq, which is the Central Market at Sandaga in Dakar. This is the dirtiest place I know in Senegal. It's horrible. And the vendors that are there are mostly of the Murid community from the center of Senegal, from Touba. And the mosque around Touba is the cleanest place I've ever seen. There's sand, but they clean every grain of sand. So I was wondering, maybe the streets, the public, what we call public space in our cities, is mainly, and that's very interesting that we talk about the genders, the question that you rose. It's mainly a space of confrontation, of economic confrontation, and of establishing your social value. I do believe that that may be a reason why you have so many men in the street, in the informal sector. I mean, again, the example of Dakar, there's no job, no formal job that is offered to those guys. So they say, we are going to the informal because there's no way that they can make it another way. To go to the informal, they have their own way of using the space, which is completely different from what our urbanists and architects have designed. I mean, the street walks are normally meant to allow people to walk. The streets walk are being used as marketplaces, as places to sleep. And the terrible thing is in the last 10 years, I've seen a shift. Those places were mainly male places. Now you've got so many female getting involved in the informality of this, which to me is a way of showing the destruction of the old way of sociability. Now, do we have a tool? For the moment, I just recognize the failure of the traditional tools that we've been using. The way we plan cities, the way we organize the cities. You know, we have a plan, Dakar 2025. All the hypotheses that have been used are actually completely obsolete. And we're not in 2025. So I believe we have to rethink completely our way of organizing the spaces. I would start with confronting the rural urban migrations. First of all, try to understand why the people are leaving the countryside to come to the city. In the case of Dakar, it's very simple. You have 93% of the job opportunities that are made available in Dakar. So of course, they will come to Dakar. So to me, it's not a problem of architectural or urbanistic tools. It's a problem of rethinking the society and rethinking the way that we design policies towards our people. I'm not sure I answered the question, but that's the point I am in.
Thanks, Jean-Charles. Ikem, you want to come in?
Yes, absolutely. I think that, you know, your question made me think, as an architectural practitioner, would I actually take the bait of an expectation that architecture can actually ever hope to intervene or resolve successfully the issues of turbulence in a place like Maiduguri? Because I suspect that it's much bigger than the sort of tools that architects have, and that architects have been drawn into sort of imagining that design can produce the kind of outcomes that some theorists once claimed. And I sort of use sort of this sort of European history of modernism that, of course, interjected in places like Kano and Kaduna and other cities in terms of the sort of idea of the Grand Master Plan. That ultimately gets subverted by the logic of the extractive economies to which most African nation states are still very much subject. But I also didn't want to be completely pessimistic. And I imagine that there's a possibility actually within education, even education of, you know, those we now call urban planners and urban designers, to move away from a certain, again, at the beginning, I sort of spoke about territorial correspondence between a certain group and a space that they occupy in the city that is bounded and expels or is meant to expel other kinds of people from occupying the same space, and how my first encounter with some of the more traditional Sahelian cities seemed to operate on a very, very different logic. And I sort of remember the first time I saw Khane Kaye's image of Timbuktu, which is partly imaginative, that one of the things it makes very, very emphatic is how transience and permanence somehow occupies the same space simultaneously all the time. And I think that a kind of architectural education that paid more attention to a different notion of temporality within space and within even the physical building, between who has a right to be where. Hussein at some point was sort of, I think it was Hussein was sort of talking about people building sort of gated communities now in some context. that I think within our architectural education, to the extent that it sort of produces a new crop of young architects who might be more attuned to some of the difficulties produced by urban planning tactics and strategies and proposals, may, together with a more mature politics in a way, lead to the kind of possibility for the future that is actually much more connected to what happened in the Sahelian cities before the colonial moment. I mean, very recently I heard that young Hausa man in Kano are sort of blocking roads because they don't want Fulani peoples to sort of enter their space. I mean, there's a sort of bigger politics, you know, we encounter the Fulani in relation to the Dogon, the Fulani in relation to the Bamana. It's a kind of trans-Sahelian problem, right? But I was a little bit shocked because it's as if the young people have started to sort of think in a way that their fathers and grandfathers would not have, right? And there are sort of reasons why space is becoming territorialized in a particular way. But it's very, very possible that through designs, I mean, governors of states and of cities get opportunities sometimes to sort of commission large interventions within parts of a city. And I think that with a different understanding of the relationship between space and time, in the manner that someone like Elizabeth Grotz has written about more recently, might actually enable a different form of contemporary urban space and architecture to emerge that with a, as I said, with a more mature politics, might actually lead to something very, very different from what's happening in Maiduguri. I mean, Maiduguri of all places, it's incredible if one actually knows the sort of history of mixture in a place like Maiduguri with all its connections to Libya and to sort of Kano further south, that this is actually happening in the sort of 21st century world.
Thank you so much, Ikem. Mpo, did you want to, should we?
Yeah. Yeah, please. So I mean, thank you all to our great panelists. We have about 10 minutes left and a few questions in our dialogue box. So I just wanted to say very quickly that this has been incredibly illuminating for me, and it's actually a question that I have for you, Malik, about like what kind of space is the Sahel? And there's a question in our dialogue box by Emmanuel, who he has a number of questions, but the one that I want to highlight right now is how do we define the Sahel today, and by whom is the Sahel defined? And I think it's a layered question, not simply in terms of like, you know, definitional terms, but like there's something about looking at the Sahel, which is your proposition, that is offering something potentially to ways of thinking about modes of inhabitation. And it also disrupts linear conceptions of time. So I want to ask this question with Emmanuel about how does one define Sahel, and who is defining it, and how is it being defined?
Well, can I defer to Ikem or to Usena, who are much more knowledgeable? But just quickly, I mean that it is a critical question, as those definitions have changed over time, and the different impositions of different imaginaries that come from many different kinds of locations that try to lend some kind of coherence to a region which, in some sense, resists in some way a kind of definitiveness to it, a kind of overarching coherence to it. So there are ecological imaginaries, there are political ones, there are ones that emerge from within ECOWAS, there's ones that are imposed. But in some sense is the continuous remaking of different territories of operation that include different kinds of compositions of actors at different times with what Mamadou Diouf has always called the more or less, the more or less this, the more or less that, and is like, you know, an accordion in some ways that, and the operations of that accordion with Adeline produce different acoustics, a different kind of oral sense, a different kind of voice. But there's a certain atomacy to it as well. I mean, one of my good friends in Dakar insists upon saying, I'm not Senegalese, I'm Sahelian. This is who I am. And so I think these are factors at work to respond to that question. But I leave it to others more knowledgeable than me to come in.
Well, am I still unmuted? Yes, I think I'll say very quickly that there are a number of ways in which I would define the Sahel, right? Well, for our listeners in general, I think it would be important to mention that the word Sahel and the word Swahili is actually basically the same word, right? It's sort of like an East African version of the Sahel is actually Swahili. And so the sort of Swahili coast in its sort of hybrid nature is sort of interesting to sort of place next to our own sort of West African Sahel, in which a sort of different set of and kind of ethnicity arose, right? So as far as I know, there isn't a Swahili people spread across the Sahel in sort of West Africa in the way it is on the East African coast. And I think that suggests a different kind of possibility for futures for sure, given that there was a resistance to sort of producing an ethnic, what's the word, dominance of a particular kind of space in between the Sahara and sort of subtropical West Africa. But I also know that the Sahel is extensive, right? It's all the way from Senegal, and on the BBC, I was sort of listening to a program recently where they were sort of talking about the conflict in Sudan, that is North Sudan in relation to Darfur. And it sort of absolutely described the Darfur region as belonging to the Sahel. So I think the Sahel is sort of this vast space that's also, in a way, partly tragically due to sort of climate change and all that is expanding, but it's a sort of vast zone with all kinds of potentials for interaction between peoples that would be difficult to imagine actually in any other region in Africa, precisely because it's sort of crossing the continent from east to west. Jean-Charles?
Yeah,
Adeline?
I would comment quickly. I would add the cultural notion. Of course, Sahel sometimes is defined as a geographical notion, but in Sahel, we have a kind of cultural unity. We were talking about the Fulani, as you call them in Nigeria or in other countries. I myself, I'm a Fulani. The Tal family is the family that spread the jihad in West Africa with Sheikh Omar Tal. And we refer to ourselves not as Fulani or Peul or Tukulur, but as Halpularim, those who speak Pular, which is our language. And that's the same language that you find I went to Cameroon and there were people playing football. I was watching a football match in the street, a football game, and suddenly I heard those people speaking and I was like, am I in Senegal or? And the Fulani in Cameroon, in Nigeria, in Senegal, in Guinea, in the south of Mauritania, basically speak the same language. But historically, we have to remember that our small countries are colonial things. I mean, Senegal, of course, we had our traditional kingdoms, but we were included in the Mali Empire. We were included in the Songhai Empire, etc., etc. So we have those large unities that we had historically that we completely not only forget, but we don't teach the young people the basis of this unity. And we can extend it to all the work that has been done by Sheikh Anta Diop on African cultural unity, and you'll find out that those are the same people, the same families. I have parents in Mali that are my closest cousins, but we have different nationalities. I have parents in the Gambia, they speak English, I speak French, but we are from the absolute same family. So wherever in the Sahel you go, you will find that the family links cross the borders, especially between Niger and Nigeria. Well, I mean, those are the same people. And you have this thing, I just found out that in, I don't remember the name of the city, but there's a border city between Niger and Nigeria, which is very commercial.
Katsina, maybe?
No,
No,
that's another name.
No.
And my friend, who's an architect in Niger, said that their family had, they were living on the Niger side, but their how you call that? Shepherd? No, it's not shepherd. I mean, the cows and etc. that they had were on the Nigerian side. When you come to Senegal, the villages in the north are on the Senegalese side, but all the fields are in the Mauritanian side. So to us, the borders, etc., they have very little meaning to the people, really. When you go to between Togo and Benin, you see the division between the different ethnic groups follow a line that is parallel to the coast. And you've got the same people on each side of the border. And the border between, on the road from Lomé to Cotonou, I mean, it's a joke. There's a chain there. And when you're not in a car, you just jump over the chain and you're in the other country. So maybe we have to rethink all the links, all the situations that we are trying to establish right now. Somebody said very clearly, I think it's Professor Adilo, that we used to live in situations where we would accept everybody because we know that some way or another we're from the same family. And I'm sure that if I go to Niger, I went there once to Mali, and one architect said we should not allow the strangers to work in Mali, talking about me. And I said, listen, gentlemen, I don't speak, at that time I did not speak Bambara. And I said, I don't speak Bambara, but if we go to Segu, I'm a Tal and you're a Sise, the one who will spend the night outside is not me. And that's true.
Can I say something?
Adeline, come on, please, yes.
So I'm actually really interested in this question of what the Sahel is, because, I mean, it seems to me that for lay persons, it is an eco-climactic zone. And in part, this is why it's always seen as a place that's plagued by drought and famine. I mean, there is a kind of, it's the crisis is inherently part of the geography, part of the and so I wonder if when we speak of Sahelian cities, if we are able to sort of trouble that connection by taking away the Sahel from its rootedness in an eco-climactic zone and putting it more squarely in a space of cosmopolitanism. So I wonder what you're thinking. What were you thinking? Because I've noticed, you know, when we write books, sometimes we use the name of the country. Sometimes we want to be more emphatic or expensive and we use West Africa. But I've noticed that some people cling to the notion of the Sahel. Barbara Cooper, for instance, speaks of Sahelian this, Sahelian that. So I wonder what the Sahelian city does that West African city doesn't do, right? Does it reinscribe the city in a historic space in a way that Ikem was talking about, right? A space of connections, of commerce, of Islamic architecture, of art, of traditions that are not colonial, right? So I wondered what you had in mind, and if that's how we should think about it. Because it seems to me that listening to my colleagues, I do agree that we have to rethink the society. I mean, I think this is what Usaina and Jean-Charles were talking about. It's not just architecture, right? It is about the social, which is why, for me, thinking about young women in Niger, I mean, I'm troubled because what I'm thinking is, well, we need to work on gender parity. It's not there. We're not anywhere near, despite the way in which politicians have created a space of gender parity, in the National Assembly. But in ordinary society, it's not there, which is why I cannot imagine the young women in the city, right? So I wonder, what does Sahelian urbanism add to the conversation that sort of recuperates tradition and history, but moves us forward away from ecological disasters?
Yeah, thank you, Adeline. I mean, it's precisely this kind of provocation that we had in mind. That a region that is increasingly identified as a place of intense problematic volatility, to flip it, to invert it, and to see that as, in some sense, pointing to a series of capacities of urban life, of urbanization processes that in some ways signals some, as I said at the beginning, a more pluriversal notion of what the urban means. And in some ways, it's the very potentiality of this so-called region, which is being abrupted, not because in some ways it manifests some kind of deficit or absence, but rather there's a kind of plenitude which has become problematic within a larger global arena. And to discover within that plenitude a certain kind of resourcefulness, a certain kind of manifestation of another urbanization, which has a lot, I think, to tell us, and of which I think all of you in tonight have in some ways emphasized. So yes, Impo, where are we? Do you?
Well, I would like to thank everybody for being in the conversation, but I think I would also like to give the closing remarks to the mayor of Agadir, Professor Usaina Alidou, who is yet to offer us her own definition of Sahel. And then with that, I'll just say a few closing thank you remarks.
All right. You like me to say something?
As the mayor.
As the mayor.
You're the political one.
So I'm just really grateful for you and Professor Malik to have convened us to this conversation about the Sahel and about Agadez. Outside the imaging, outside the ways in which a lot has been written since recent crisis. So I think Agadez, the way I see it, under the Sahel, Agadez, Tawa, Timbuktu, Jene, Kano, Maiduguri, I think there is a lot for us to, we have to look at those cities. They have been in connection with each other, and they will continue to be in connection. And there is a lot of, all the way to Andalusia even. So if we have to look at even mapping of cities, we have to look at the relationship. I think of Agadez and the Sahel as hospitality, as really the great model if Africans and policymakers and investors are to reimagine space within a culture of peace and prosperity. They have to look at indigenous ways of managing resources and accommodation and adjustments to situation. The Sahel is a place by its own geography, its climate. It is vulnerable, and vulnerability has created a culture of resilience, a culture of adjustment and adaptability, a culture of embracing what the visitor is going to bring to empower this place as we empower the visitor too. So I'm saying that my father is from that region. So it's very important. I am from that region, and I know what it is at stake from that perspective. When the question of ID was censors, during different regime, there is a time where censorship has to take place. What is interesting, both my father and my maternal grandfather, both of them told us, the whole family, if we are imposed by the state to have to mark our ethnicity, then we should mark all the ethnicity that define us as Sahelian, because they are product of brassage. They cannot fragment that they're Fulani, they're Tuareg, they're Kanuris, they're Arabs, they're Bambara, because I am Sidibe and Kone by my mother. They come from Guinea. They're Fulanis from Guinea, who the French brought to Niger. I'm not going to say I'm not Fulani from Guinea or from Mali. This is part of me. And I'm not also going to tell my father's side that they are not Hausa and they're not Fulani and they're not Tuareg, because they are that. And it's the only way I could define myself as a Sahelian, through that way of being flexible to recognize all the fragment of who we are and we are becoming. That's the future. And I'm not the only one. There are some people who may not be a composite of all that, but they are also Sahelian because their very existence depends on the other. So I think I'm grateful and thankful to each one of you for all the perspective that you have brought and for inviting us. We believe in the future. We will continue to live and hope. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to say in closing, thank you so much to everybody, Professor Alidou, Professor Mascalier, Professor Okoye, soon to be Professor Jean Charlton, and also Professor AbdouMaliq Simone. This has been an incredibly enriching conversation, and I think that we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this conversation, and hopefully it will continue in other fora and in other spaces as well. And I'd also like to say a very, very special thank you once again to AbdouMaliq Simone for proposing this as a discussion and as a way of sort of really deepening our ongoing interrogation of African spatialities beyond the paradigm of crisis. I'd also just like to say thank you to everybody who was able to stay with us for the duration of this panel discussion. Profuse apologies for all of our technical difficulties, but hopefully it was very much worth your while to be with us. The recording will be posted on our website, on YouTube, and also on Facebook for those of you who are not able to join. And once again, thank you to the Goethe Institute, who made the entirety of African Mobilities possible, particularly the podcast series. Thank you very much to the Urban Institute at Sheffield University for supporting this initiative, particularly around Sahelian urbanism. And thank you to all our panelists and the questions that came through. And with that, I wish you all a very, very good night or a good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. So for more updates about African Mobilities, please find us on social media, African Mobilities on Instagram and Facebook, AMobilities on Twitter, and also our website, www.africanmobilities.org. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you, everyone, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Nice
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.